So Nicola is a theologian based in Auckland. She specialises in the interface between evolutionary theory and systematic theology, and has broad interests also in all issues of public and contextual theology and ecology. Her recent book, Animal Suffering and the Problem of Evil, examined theodicy given the reality of long eons of animal suffering before humans arrived.
Referring for you. No, you said you.
She is currently completing a book on free will. Nicola has taught theology and previously mathematics in the US and New Zealand. She is co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science and is an adjunct supervisor at Flinders University, South Australia. She worships at All Saints in Ponsonby. So I'll just unmute this one. There's an unruly unmuted person, which I've just dealt with. A very warm welcome, Nicola. We're very pleased that you're able to come and share with us. And we're keen to hear and to learn and to engage with these issues. So it's over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for being here. I look forward to hearing from you too in the course of the evening. I think the fact that we're all here is sort of evidence of just how serious this problem is and the burden that we all feel in the face of it. And certainly this pandemic does have repercussions both in the area of science and faith. So it's certainly a topic that spans both of these disciplines. So what I'm going to do tonight is, first of all, look at the pandemic as a case of natural evil. And you probably will all have looked at this before, but I think it's worth going through it again. And I'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, as Mark said, and then I will, then we'll have some discussion, and then perhaps I'll look at those other two questions. Is this a case of judgment? And also, why can't we just heal like Jesus heals? So,
Nicola, we've just lost your audio, unfortunately.
You push it in a...
Is that better now?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. Don't know what happened there. Okay, so in a pandemic, or in any case of natural evil, the natural world, which nurtures us and gives us life, seems to turn against us, which raises the question, why? And everything for a long time is more or less in balance, and then that balance is destroyed, which is very confusing. And those of you in Christchurch, of course, had some sort of dress rehearsal for all of this. And you probably know that the most shocking case of natural evil in the modern era was in Lisbon in 1755, when there was an earthquake which destroyed most of Lisbon, including all its churches. And it was on All Saints' Day, so most people were in church at the time that the earthquake hit. And it was followed by a tsunami and also a fire. And this earthquake deeply affected European thought and religion, and it opened up a profound strain of skepticism, which independent science has thrived on ever since. So this problem is not a new problem, even if this particular pandemic is very new. Excuse me. And I think this pandemic is very serious. It looks as though it's set to be a long-term problem, not something that something which is tragic but over and done with quickly, although, Stephen, you might disagree with that. It seems to be mild enough that people can actually deny it exists, but lethal enough that it's interfering with our common life and our economic sustainability and all those sorts of things. It raises all the questions we've encountered before about natural evil, but perhaps even more so. And it raises the question, is our common life even going to be possible in the future? So the first question really is, why doesn't God just intervene or gently nudge the forces upheld by God in a certain direction? And it may seem as though we've looked at this question over and over again, and of course we know the answer. God's intentions are good. God loves us. How difficult would this be for a God who is ultimately responsible for everything that is? But as humans, I think we go very quickly to omnipotence. The cognitive science of religion tells us that even small children naturally think that the being they understand as God is all-powerful. The act of prayer inclines us to believe in omnipotence, and when things go well for a while, that reinforces this idea as well. So it isn't something that's easy to budge. And then there is the goodness of creation. How can a virus, which is a part of God's good creation, surely do so much harm? So although the problem is old, we are all surprised. And it isn't just that we're surprised, it really does shock us. I've written at length on the problem of evil, but natural evil still shocks me. And I think it's because we look at nature and it seems to be so densely interconnected and in fact so finely tuned to affirm life. And this deep nurturing interconnection is a part of what makes us feel loved by God and in awe of God. So natural evil on this scale feels like a betrayal. And the question is, why doesn't God act if God is omnipotent and good and the creation is good? So there are a number of so-called responses or defenses, and I think there is something in all of them, even though they all also fail. But I think we must consider them. The problem goes so deep that we can't say that this is an answer, and the tragedy is so deep that that if we come to peace with it, I think we've failed. They just point us along the way to the way things are. They tell us something about the nature of existence. So just to summarize what I think, sure most of you have heard before, one answer for why God doesn't intervene is because God has created a world of freedom. We are speaking here of individual decisions, like I'm free to cross the road so God won't save me from an accident. It is more at the level of the underlying structure of existence. Freedom means being a volitional creature and having values and making choices, and having needs and desires, and living in a community of creatures like this. And of course, I'm leaving open the idea that there might be creatures other than humans in this situation as well. So God has created a free world. And in some sense, at the very foundations of everything, creation is intimately indwelt by God, but God is not a puppet master. We aren't saying God could, but God decides to let us all be free, like the parent of a teenager. It is more that if there is freedom at all, it can't coincide with God's direct intervention. We have to live with these twin poles. God is immanent, God is the creator, but God is not a controlling being. It's very tempting to think that our image of God as omnipotent means that God can do anything. God is depicted as drowning the Egyptians, for example. But at another level, the incarnation is perhaps suggestive that making things new is costly for God as well. So whatever it is that God has done in creation has a certain integrity and almost autonomy. And in any talk of God, there is ultimately paradox. Specifying that God doesn't intervene runs the risk of making God appear distant and uncaring. Yet we know that's not the case. The Book of Wisdom and the whole idea of logos, as well as eco-theology and sacramental theology, all of these emphasize the very closeness of God to the natural world, animating matter and life. And synchronicity and answers to prayer in our lives are all evidence of divine presence. So our notion of an intervening and deeply present God are very close to the surface of our God idea, but lead us down very paradoxical pathways. Somehow or other, to create is to cede power, not by arbitrary choice, but by the very act of giving free creatures choice. If this is difficult, it has always been so. It raises questions like, what should we pray for? How can we pray? How does God act? Where is God in the natural world? The act of thinking about freedom helps us to see a little clearer what the grammar of God is, but leaves us uneasy. And this leads directly to the other big response, which is that this is the best of all possible worlds. It may be unsatisfactory, but if we had a world like this, it couldn't be any better. God couldn't have made what some people call better finite dust. And again, this relates to the deepest of all levels of existence. The idea that at the foundations of everything, life could not have arisen in any other way. Now, theoretically, that's empirically observable. We could find aliens with different propensities. And of course, there are pockets of life on Earth that are much more peaceful than other pockets. So this sort of confounds this idea in some way. But is this the best of all possible worlds? And what comfort is that to a victim of tragic natural upheaval? It would be different if we all suffered equally. So these responses don't allow us to just shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's settled then. The best of all possible dust. Those of you who read Philip Pullman will know that the quest of the Book of Dust is a way of creating better dust, getting rid of that dust of fallenness or original sin, which is a fascinating idea. But then there are the more Christian responses that relate directly to God and our lives as believers. Ways that we respond as people who believe. We may be puzzled and disturbed and we may grieve, but faith is a kind of trust. So some have suggested that perhaps evil and suffering are soul makers, or at least they build character. They make us at least a bit stronger. In suffering, sometimes we can participate in the sufferings of Christ. But as we all know, that only applies to certain levels of suffering, and what is called horrendous evil, which is quite common, undermines human flourishing. More religious answers are that God will make all things work together for good, and Christ has come to suffer with us. So these aren't trivial answers. They go to the heart of faith, and they are the essence of faith. But they don't take away our questions about God's interventions. Openness of God and process, theologians say, just that God can't intervene. And all of these responses assume a certain understanding of God and of salvation. Whatever position we take, it does appear to be the case that God works through relationships with humans more than in any other way. And I should say here that this problem is particularly contemporary because evolution has eliminated an easy historical fall explanation for all evil. That was once a possible comprehensive explanation, which covered everything, but is no longer possible. So before we open all this to you, I want to look briefly also at the problem in an evolutionary context. I've been interested not only in the human problem of evil, but how it really extends far back into evolutionary history. Sentient creatures of all kinds have suffered disease and predation. And most of these theodicies work best with humans and less well when we think of a suffering natural world. So I argued in this book on animal suffering that the parable of the wheat and the tares can be extended back into evolutionary history and outwards into the natural world as well, and the cultural and social worlds. There are disordered elements of the natural world and elements that are good, and in this finite life, they cannot be separated without doing harm to the good. The wheat and the tares shows us that everything is deeply entwined with something else, and we can't separate out the good and the bad. And the bad might be relative. So for instance, there is good and bad about democracy that would we would do terrible harm to human life if we tried to eliminate all the harmful aspects of democracy, because very often they are upholding the better aspects. And people then ask, well, where do all the harmful aspects come from? And that, of course, is a huge question. And I would say, first of all, that I emphasize the wheat and the tares because it is so miraculous that there is any wheat still left and that it is even growing, because tares can be so destructive. And this miracle is a pointer to God in itself. But increasingly, I am aware also of the inherent limitations of finitude, which explains in part why creation can never be perfect. Finite existence lives very much in relationship, almost in an infinite array of relationships. And that perfection in one part means often imperfection in another. A virus is neutral or helpful in one creature, for instance, but harmful in another. Finitude can't ever be perfect, even if it is beautiful. So the peaceable kingdom from Isaiah is a tantalizing, but in this world impossible picture. This imperfection opens up cracks in which alienation from God can happen. We have an idea of normal being almost perfect, and disease is everything that deviates from that. But normal is never anything like perfect, really. A person, for instance, flourishes in ideal circumstances, but that hardly makes them the essence of perfection in themselves. So everything in the natural world is dependent on relationship. And although rooting out the tares is very difficult, there are more indirect ways of encouraging the wheat to grow. So building healthy communities that are fair and good for all creatures is one way. Taking care of the least, whether that is humans or creatures, taking care of the land, and so on. The grammars of the gospel and the tools of the Spirit. These indirect ways of trying to promote the good will also discourage the growth of the tares. So the virus is a case in point. It exists quite harmlessly in bats, as does Ebola, but not in relationship to us. But we and all creatures are utterly dependent on viruses. Human DNA and the DNA of all creatures is probably between 12 and 60% viral, which is extraordinary. There are deep recesses in the evolutionary process we don't understand, but they open up new vistas of interconnectivity and interdependence between the most marginal habitations of life, which is viruses, and the most advanced in ourselves. Like the bugs in our gut, some bugs are good and some aren't, or some are bad in the wrong ratio to other bugs. Everything depends on relationship and timing. This virus is bad for us now, but who knows what its future trajectory will be. So to summarize this part, I want to say that there are ways we can think about natural evil. They aren't pat answers. They lead us to dwell on the nature of existence and the bedrock of creation and of faith. And in thinking of God, we always reach paradox. But it is important probably to rid ourselves of some of the more puppet master images of God that we have and that come naturally to us, while also acknowledging God's deep presence with us and in us. So I'll just stop here and we can have some discussion, and then I'll come back to the other questions, if that's all right.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I'll just come off Spotlight View and come back to Gallery View. So we have one question, but I'm sure your minds have been teased sufficiently to begin thinking about other questions that you might like to ask. Quite a number of themes have been presented. So I will go to the first question, and if others would like to type your questions, then go ahead right now. So the first question is from Glenda. Thank you for this. Why are you using the term natural evil? And I think that's quite a good question, because I hadn't thought of that question myself. So Nicola, over to you.
Okay, so I mean, I'm using the word natural, the term natural evil, as opposed to moral evil, which is the evil that humans perpetrate. So natural evil is evil that seems to be something which is at least evil from our perspective. And I've sort of said that everything is a matter of relationship, but that is certainly something which is harmful to human life and prospering. And the natural world is normally a place which is nurturing of human life and flourishing, and of other creatures, and of the nurturing of other creatures as well. So we experience something like this virus as a natural evil, something which is afflicting us in some way, and is not the result of any person's action in any sense. Does that make sense?
So, Glenda, how is that? You've raised your hand, I note. So, is there a second bite of that cherry you'd like to offer?
My question was particularly why using the term evil or something which we might call part of the natural world. I can understand, for example, evil at work in wet markets in Asia, in decisions that might or might not have been made at the beginning in China, in the way in which various people around the world are or are not responding to it. But I cannot, for example, see evil at work in an earthquake. It's a force of nature. And in a similar way, but not quite the same, I associate evil somehow with either spiritual realities or the free will of human beings. And so I struggle with the concept of evil in nature. That's what's behind my question.
Sure.
Yeah, and that sort of begs the question of the whole exercise. Except that, would you accept that disease is an evil?
I would say disease is.
Okay.
A disease is because if we want to go back to a worldview, the fallen nature of the world we live in, which includes entities, things that we might not see as God's good and perfect will, but which are, because we live in a world that is less than good and perfect, and as you say, in some cases, evil. So for me, it's a matter of can we attach evil to things that are not actually making a choice, I suppose.
Just to butt in for a moment, I mean, the word evil sounds like a moral category, doesn't it, that we might apply to human agents or spiritual agents, but not necessarily the natural world. So the word evil and the word natural don't, in some ways, don't necessarily fit. Final comment, Nicola, we have another question come through.
Yes, well, I don't mind how you define it, but I do think that in a sense the virus itself is not evil, but it is a natural affliction of human beings at the moment. Yeah. And so in that sense we can call it evil in the same way that disease is. I would want to de-emphasize the fall, in fact, but to emphasize that the creation doesn't always work in a way which is for the flourishing of either humans or other creatures.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thank you. There's a second question here from Jordan. So thank you for this, Jordan. It strikes me that Nicola's language of relationship has some connection with the Hebrew concept of shalom as the right ordering of relationship. Has Nicola thought much about evil in relation to God's coming future and the fulfillment of creation in right and flourishing relationship? I'm sure you have.
Yes, and I think, Isaiah 65 and the peaceable kingdom is a sort of tantalizing view of that peace in an eschatological sense. And it's tantalizing because it simply cannot be in the present day. We can't have animals that are predators sitting down with animals that aren't, for example. And yet that is the tantalizing image that God has given us. And so I think that, yes, that the future eschatological peace that we seek and that we try to work for as much as possible here is one in which all finite creatures are in peace with all other finite creatures. But because of the nature of finitude, that's impossible in most cases here. And all we can try and do is maximize that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jordan, is there a follow-up that you'd like to ask?
Thank you, Nicola. I appreciated your answer. I just think it offers a way for us to think about evil maybe less as natural evil and more of, as you say, the state of our world and finitude. Shalom is an eschatological category that will never be realized this side of the eschaton. And so we wait and hope and we work and hope.
Yeah.
But that disordering of relationship is part of the nature of God's working things out, as it were.
Thank you. That's great. Any other questions? While people are thinking, we've got another 5 or so minutes for this segment, so just feel free to get typing. I was intrigued, Nicola, by your phrase about this world is the best possible world, and I know I've heard that discussed by others, Christian philosophers, for example, that what is to come is incomparable. So, we need to kind of get used to this world. It is the best possible one, but there is better. There's a better.
Well, I'm not really necessarily saying that it is, but I'm saying that this is one way in which, people approach evil or respond to this kind of natural predicament or evil, or whatever you want to call it, is to say, well, we couldn't have a world like this with the kinds of values we have. It's the best of all possible worlds. Now, I think it's very interesting that in our natural world, there are some really peaceful creatures that just sit around eating grass. And there are some that depend on vicious predation. So even in our world, there are very, very big differences in terms of how peaceful creatures are. And of course, chimpanzees are quite aggressive and bonobos are quite peaceful, and we're related to both of them. So that makes us sort of Janus figures in some sort of sense. But yes.
Thank you. Another question coming from Eric J. Can you speak more about how you see the relationship between evolution and the fall? I think that's a great question.
Well, that's sort of like a big enough question to be a question in itself. Because there was disease and death and extinction long before humans came to be, humans cannot be blamed for most of the afflictions of ordinary life. And of course, Genesis was never was not always interpreted that way anyway in the ancient world. But it was at times interpreted as the whole sort of metaphysics of the world changed with Adam and Eve's sin, and that disease and death sort of came into being at that time. So obviously evolution makes that understanding of fallenness impossible. It doesn't make impossible a more sort of Eastern Orthodox understanding of evolution as really just representing the change in human consciousness at that time. And that certainly with the change in human consciousness, Wenzel van Hoosten, for example, talks about the way in which the human brain was sort of opened up, like a cathedral opening up to all its chapels. And that this enabled us and our consciousness to interact with God in a very unprecedented way, which is probably associated also with self-consciousness and with language. But obviously it also, and it was associated also with sort of hyper cooperation which occurred as in the transition to Homo sapiens. But with all of those sorts of traits also came the possibility of hyper cooperation for evil, and perhaps participation also in cooperation with powers and principalities that were opposed to God. So I would sort of see the coming to being, the transition to being Homo sapiens as being extremely significant for the future history of the planet, especially once agriculture started. But we can't blame viruses and death and extinction on humans in the way that older models of the fall sometimes did. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Do you want me to elaborate?
No, I think that's all good. Well, Eric, is there a follow-up you would like to make? No problem, if not.
Is he getting
Okay, well, it is
might
just
be unmuted. He might be muted.
Oh, I see, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Nicola. That's a good explanation.
Sorted. Okay, unless there are other questions, and I see, and there don't appear to be any. Let's make this the final one before we move on. Stephen Marshall, what the man in the street wants to know is, if God exists, why does he allow things like pandemics? Why doesn't he fix it?
Okay, so that's what I was kind of trying to explain, that God isn't the kind of God who just fixes things, because that's inconsistent with this type of world. I mean, at least this is one of the ways of responding to that question, which, people do have, that you can't really have a world which is the world like us, where we have creatures like us, or like any other creatures really, that have volition and values and things like that, and also have a God who comes along and intervenes. And at least that's one way of understanding it. And that our natural understanding of omnipotence is perhaps not completely true to the biblical record of who God is, and that we perhaps need to modify our understanding of what a God who is a creator God would necessarily do. It's something that children naturally lean to, the idea of omnipotence, and therefore God can do anything. But it's also possible that as we grow in faith and an understanding of the scriptures and of our life together, we can understand that God doesn't act that way, and that if God could act that way, then probably the incarnation would not have been necessary, because God could just fix things without there being any sort of incarnation in human flesh, and a very costly salvation as well. So that's not an argument that would help the man in the street, because he wouldn't really like the idea of the costly salvation very much. But I think it is the Christian answer. I was actually at a conference last year on transmaterialism and science, and it was a group of people who all believed really that consciousness was primary, and that materialist science just was completely inadequate, but they weren't actually Christian. And so what struck me about their sort of philosophies was really, I mean, there was a lot that I really responded to and liked, but they were more inclined to sort of say that salvation comes through meditation, or through near-death experiences, or through magic mushrooms. Apparently there are lots of those in Dunedin. And they didn't have the sort of narrative of salvation through suffering in the way that Christianity does, which I thought was very interesting.
Mm, mm. Okay, well, that's a great question. We may return to it if we've got time at the end, but I think it would be good to move to our next question for the evening, which is the pandemic, a kind of judgment?
Right. Right.
So,
and I'm not going to say so much about that, but perhaps this will be open up more questions. I don't know. I think in any crisis like this, the first thing we do is we blame other people. So in this case, we blame the Chinese, and some people blame the Chinese more than others. And in medieval plagues, it was the Jews who were blamed. And in this pandemic, it's very often old people or vulnerable people because they're messing up our economy. So blame comes first. But after we get over blame, we wonder whether this is judgment. And I think this happens individually too when we suffer some sort of setback or some sort of tragedy. We first of all wonder who we can blame, but then we sort of say, what did we do? Is this a punishment? And I think we feel that collectively as well. In the Old Testament, of course, every setback was explained as a judgment. And some interpretations of Genesis, as I've said, made all natural evil an outcome of Adam and Eve's sin. So is this virus a form of judgment on our way of living in the natural world? And in some ways, I think we can say no, because Jesus was always at pains to separate the sin of an individual from their affliction. And also, he was always healing. So his healing instincts, I think, revealed the healing instincts of God. So God isn't a God who goes around inflicting disease on people. But I think at another level, God doesn't intentionally save us from the consequences of our own actions collectively. So we can interpret this pandemic as in part the result of our disordered relationships, especially with animals. And nature as a whole is acting, perhaps in judgment. Greta, of course, has already warned us that our house is on fire, and she's right. And Jesus himself has had words of judgment for those who live in blindness. So I think explanations for events happen at multiple levels. You've probably all heard of this. The cake I bake is partly caused by my hunger, but it's also caused by the image I have of a cake in my mind and the recipe I follow. At another level, the cake is caused by sugar and flour and eggs and heat. And at yet another, the agent of baking. So you can have explanations at multiple levels. And similarly, I think with a viral infection, it can be traced back to an animal in proximity to another animal in a wet market in Wuhan. But at higher levels of explanation, we wonder how these animals came to be so close and how the population of humans came to be so susceptible to disease, living so close and in such dense proximity. So we can understand the virus as both having a natural cause and possibly a natural outcome of disordered ways of living at the same time. In the natural world, whether it is conscious or not, and possibly it is, lives in an exquisite balance, almost like a living being, and wants to return to balance. So whether this happens by divine decree or by natural outworkings of deep ecology makes little difference. The prophets knew that there was a connection between violence and disease of the land, and such a connection in some ways seems obvious to us now. And it's not only Christians, I think, but also secular people who see that there is a connection between this pandemic and interpret it and the way we behave, and see it in some sense as a judgment. But on the other hand, we can't see earthquakes that way unless we really do have an intervening God. So we must be very careful, I think, about the judgment card. And another way of seeing this is that we as humans have the responsibility of caring for the earth and promoting its flourishing. And when we don't do that and don't even notice it very often, then our failure will have consequences. So whatever the answer here is, we can be sure that God grieves over the suffering and sickness of all humanity. And if there is judgment, It's not an angry or vindictive type of judgment. And in this particular tragedy, the idea of consequences for sin might have a redemptive effect as we all think about how we might live in a more ecologically peaceful world. And this pandemic will change us. It will change what we value and how we live, we hope, and it will change the environment and perhaps our institutions forever. And some of that will be of a healing kind. So I'd say yes and no to is this a judgment? Any thoughts about that?
Right, thank you again. Are there questions on that subject of is this a judgment? It's an interesting kind of coming together of what you have called natural evil with moral evil in some ways. It's almost like it doesn't happen, as you say, with earthquakes, but here there may be some human responsibility that has taken place.
Well, there's clearly some human responsibility, but whether the magnitude of the effect is a kind of judgment or not is hard to know. And there's, I mean, certainly those who speak of the Gaia hypothesis are very quick to say that Gaia is fighting back, you know, and Gaia fighting back is a kind of judgment on humanity. So there are many humans who are prepared to say that, you know, this is some sort of judgment. And whether it is a judgment or not, it is a sign. It's a sign of what's gone wrong in the natural world and how we should be responding to it, I think.
Yeah. A couple of questions have come in. So, Steve, thank you, Steve. I tend to think that the judgment will follow our response as this rather than a visitation of evil. Is that correct? Steve, do you want to elaborate on that?
So,
Yeah.
sorry, my typing was just kind of a bit laboured there. But my guess, I tend not to think is this as being an intervention of evil, but our response is going to be judged in a sense by how we take responsibility for our fellows and for the world thereafter. And I just wonder whether that's a better use of the word judgment rather than as an intervention.
Oh yeah, I think that's, you know, I agree to some extent. I think I'm not necessarily saying this is a judgment. I'm just saying it can be understood that way, and it could consistently be understood that way. But I agree that there is another level of human activity, which is, you know, how we do react to it. And obviously, countries are reacting in extremely different ways to this pandemic. And what we've done in New Zealand is obviously very unusual. And so there'll be plenty of judgment to go around in terms of the reaction to the pandemic, I think, as well. Yeah, I agree. Is that what you meant, Stephen?
Yeah, pretty much.
Just a quick question about the Gaia hypothesis, if you could unpack that for those who have perhaps unfamiliar with it. Thank you, Jenny, for that question.
Well, the Gaia hypothesis is the result of someone called Professor Lovelock, who believes that the Earth itself as a whole has a sort of consciousness to it. It's mind-like. And that if we act in such a way as to get, if we as a species essentially become a weed species, in the sense that we are dominating other species and harming them, and therefore harming the delicate sort of ecosystem of the planet, then Gaia will, in a sense, fight back and will, will harm us. So it's easy to see why a pandemic like this might be sort of seen as Gaia's revenge in some sense. But whether there is a sort of consciousness which is beyond us or not, I think that nevertheless there are natural systems which want to stay in homeostasis and want to, there are natural sort of feedback loops, and that in many ways we're violating all the natural systems and feedback loops that exist in the world and interfering with the ecological systems. So in that sense, whether you're postulating a consciousness to the ecosystem as a whole or not, the same effect happens, that there are harmful effects coming back on human beings as a result of what we've done to the natural world.
Thank you for that. Other questions? There's just another one come through from Megan. Thank you, Megan. Is disease just one way of balancing out overpopulation, similar to predators keeping ecosystems in balance? What is a moral way to respond to overpopulation? Thank you for that.
And that's a very difficult question, because I think there are many people out there who are saying, oh, well, there are too many people, so let's just let this pandemic have its course and kill off however many people it does. Of course, in the past, we've had pandemics like the bubonic plague, which killed possibly a third of the population of Europe at a time when there was not a very high population. So what to do about high population? I mean, I think everybody thinks that, at least in the Western world, that population the population curve is actually flattening out, and that although we have a very high world population, it may not be the worst problem that we have, and that economic aid to the parts of the world that are still growing at an exponential rate is possibly the most humane method of dealing with population. But I think we run a real risk in a pandemic like this of becoming numb to mass death, and in fact even just accepting it, or even welcoming it. So it could, I think the sort of utilitarian idea that this is just going to solve the population problem is not going to be good for our moral lives and our common lives together. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's always very debatable, of course. Yeah.
Megan, any further comments or clarifications at all? Unmute if you want to come in. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll go back to Olive. Thank you for your question, Olive. Great question. Would you make a link to the Genesis role of kaitiaki that has been neglected?
Yeah, can you tell me which part of Genesis? Oh, you mean the idea of caring for the earth? Yeah. Yes, so I totally agree that if we were to read Genesis correctly, and in fact the whole of scriptures, we would be promoting kaitiaki and the guardianship and care of the natural world, and that this worldview should certainly be the Christian worldview as well. Yes, so I totally accept that. Yes, and that Maori obviously have a lot to share with us, because our Western world has alienated us, I think, just even in our thinking patterns from the natural world. We tend to be very abstract and just to think in ways that aren't necessarily very attentive to the natural world, and that therefore we have a lot to learn from this partnership.
Olive, any questions or clarification that you'd like to offer? You can type. Oh, here we are. Thank you. Or Don. Just unmute Don. Sometimes those little mute buttons are hard to find, aren't they? And unfortunately, I can't do anything from my end.
Trying to, but it's not working.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. The in Genesis, like the idea of guardian or kaitiaki is emphasised, and I think to an extent that we often weigh up against that kaitiaki responsibility against moral evil. But there is a sort of a link, I think, to that morality evil when we neglect and fail to prevent the harm to God's people. I guess an example of that is in conscious knowledge we were building on swamp. We put people on the swamp that were most of the damage done to their housing and property and Bristol life was through that sort of kaitiaki. We weren't protecting our people from nature. While New Zealand was built because of the earthquakes, we didn't do what we could to protect. And maybe that could be applied to pandemic, that as we fail to apply what we know of wildlife and human viruses, we fail to protect them. And also when we find out that there's a cluster, we have prioritised the wealth of the nation or the prosperity of the few ahead of the survival of the people, the human life of the aged. Those are issues you covered very well earlier on. What do you think? Do you think there is an angle there that, to some extent, moral evil has a link to that kaitiaki responsibility?
Yeah, I think if I understand you, yes. I mean, and that it can be implied even to earthquakes to some extent. You know that Lisbon had earthquakes before, for example. I mean, Christchurch, there were people who said, don't build a cathedral there, or don't build a tower there, or whatever. And but they were not heeded. And in terms of the Boxing Day tsunami, of course, people had been building on the sand dunes and things like that. So, and not perhaps heeding the sort of more ancient wisdom, which says go to higher ground when there's, when you feel an earthquake. So I think there is a sort of an attentiveness to the natural world which comes with kaitiaki, which we ignore at our peril. And the same would be true of pandemics. There are, in traditional societies, there are ways of dealing with infection and preventing infection, and so perhaps looking for signs of it, which have not been heeded in our much more complex societies, much more technological societies. So I think that's true, that there is that level of responsibility there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicola. Just another question coming from Sue Baldwin. Thank you, Sue. It's tempting to see the pandemic as a judgment for some evil in our lives, but one of the prime themes of Job is that we cannot know the fundamental causes of suffering in our lives.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's why I'm very tentative about the idea of it being a judgment. But nevertheless, there is such a thing as judgment, and I think in this case, you can make a case for it. But I would agree that ultimately we can't know, and that the book of Job is extremely important in terms of especially individual suffering. You know, it's not only Job, of course, but Jesus who said, you know, you can't blame the person for their sickness or their affliction or their suffering. And his instinct was always to heal. So yes, I think that especially with individuals, that's the case. And but on the other hand, you can also see that if, you know, as was mentioned before, with the whole idea of katiaki, if you're not actually doing the right thing or living the right way, or if you're not being attentive to the natural world, if you're not caring for it, then it will, in a sense, fight back. There will be a reaction. There will be a consequence to that. And whether we call it a consequence or whether we call it judgment, it's the same thing. Yeah. But I think it's very important, you know, not to sort of go around saying, oh, you know, you're suffering because of this. But we might say we are, perhaps because we've been inattentive to the natural world. Yeah.
Sue, any further comments? Oh, okay.
That's okay, Mark.
Yes.
I thought about this because of Megan's question about disease being just one way of balancing out overpopulation, and you know, I'm not happy with thinking about the coronavirus as some kind of parallel to myxomatosis in rabbits. You know, the world operates as the world is going to operate. You know, that's an idea that's been expressed here several times in different ways. You know, whether that's earthquakes or floods or cyclones or disease or famine or whatever it is. You know, the creation has a freedom to operate because of the way God has set it to work. And you know, we jump to conclusions about why that is at our peril, I think.
Thank you. Nicola.
Yes, I think we can't help trying to make connections, but jumping to conclusions is certainly wrong, yes. Yeah. No, I get your point about, and I agree with you. I don't think we should see it like myxomatosis in rabbits. But on the other hand, we can see perhaps the world of humans as being essentially in a very fragile state, you know, both socially, culturally, and biologically at the moment. And although perhaps human population is leveling off, we do have very dense populations. And it has been sort of noted that the virus is worse in places of high pollution. You know, you know, Wuhan, for example, and Lombardy and New York are all places where very high pollution exists, and they're the places which seem to be most afflicted by the virus as well. So there are connections between, and I think it's important for us to make these connections as well, because we can then respond, as Steve says, we can respond and try to make a better society, or realize that these the things that we're doing are actually making our health worse in some way. Now, we talk an awful lot about carbon dioxide and how bad it is, but it's very hard to see carbon dioxide. So we don't get much feedback. But you know, a virus we can see, and the effects of it we can see. So.
Thank you. Tony, you're up next. I'll make this the last one before we go to our third question. And Tony, I'll get you to pose that question directly, I think, rather than me reading it this time, just to do something a bit different.
Yeah, I'm not really asking a question. I'm really stating, I think perhaps even restating Nicola's point that the way we see judgment and the way we see finitude is a wee bit different when we are in it. it's a bit hard to see beyond it. It's a bit hard to put ourselves into perspective with the whole of creation. And so for me, you can either see God as an absent God leaving us to get on with it, or you can see God as having created a world in which we exist. And now he's created an opportunity for us to cope with whatever we do with it. And we can make it better. We can learn from it. We can engage with it. We can be in a relationship with creation. And it's our responsibility to do so for the benefit of all of us. I've really enjoyed your talk. I wouldn't have used the word finitude, I guess, and balance and judgment in the same sentence on a previous occasion. So thank you for that.
And I also agree that, you know, that a lot of the questions about so-called natural evil and God's intervention assume that God is the only actor, and everything in scriptures shows us that there's a covenant, there's a relationship between God and us, and we are acting and God is acting, and it's not just a matter of God acting, it's also this relationship which matters so much. So I agree with you.
Okay, well, we will move on to our final question for tonight, which has to do with healing. Why can't Christians heal like Jesus does? And some may disagree with that. I don't know. Maybe you can. But I'd love to hear your...
I think in a sense, I think we can. But not quite like Jesus. This is the season of John, those of you who are in liturgical churches. And John, of course, is full of miracle stories and healing stories. And we had one the other day of the healing of the man born blind. And so, you know, obviously, if we are in the middle of a pandemic, the question arises, well, why can't we also heal like Jesus does, just by touching, you know? And we'd get rid of it quickly that way. We are meant to be the body of Christ in the world, so we should be able to heal. So I think I would understand Jesus' healings as, in some sense, the breaking in of the divine, the light of the world, in anticipation of a future eschatological peace. That in a sense, he gets there before us. He's showing us what the future's like. And so I think he really did heal, and that he healed because he had some sort of divine power. But that power was a harnessing of the natural capacities of nature in an unusual way. There have been healers in Jesus' time and since. He wasn't the only healer around. And there has been accumulated wisdom in shamans and traditional healers who knew plants and used touch. And there are some today, you know, in Reiki and acupuncture and other modes of healing. And healing revivals in the church are also real. But like Jesus, I think these healers heal one by one, and mostly in unpredictable ways, and not in ways that can be reproduced. They can't be made into a technique. Many of these healers do depend on some sort of intuitive understanding of wholeness. That is a unique gift, and they draw on hidden powers on the hidden healing powers of nature. And if we go to the book of Revelation, I think we see that in the New Jerusalem, there are trees for the healing of the nations. And so even at the end, healing is an imperative, and it comes from within nature itself. And today, of course, if we think about our medicines, many of them come originally from plants or from the soil. You know, penicillin and aspirin and digoxin and opiates and Taxol. But in order to get these, we have to labor to find them. And we almost never thank God for the gift of these healing compounds directly from nature, especially when they come in little pills. But I think this labor results in Western medicine, and at this time, especially in a pandemic, it is this Western medicine that is the most important aspect of healing for us, especially, you know, in fighting this pandemic. So in spite of the possibility of miracles, or so-called miracles, I think it's scientific healing that we most depend on, and has made the most difference, especially in the pandemic. And it's made pandemics almost things of the past, almost. But of course, our scientific healing is also a gift from God. I think it's incredible that in just 3 or 4 months, we know the shape and the mechanics of this virus. It's in every newspaper. We know its genetic code. We know how its genetic code is changing. We can map it. We know exactly where it's come from. Then all this is within a few months of its discovery. And I think it's astounding that we also already have test kits around the world able to measure it. And it's astounding that we have a World Health Organization and epidemiologists and virologists in every country able to speak with authority, even if they don't always speak the same thing. They don't always agree. So I think we do know healing. It just doesn't look quite like the healing of Jesus. We have to labor mostly over our healing. It's creaturely healing, but it is nonetheless healing. I think there are other kinds of healing, as I said. You know, there are people who can heal, but that's not what we rely on in everyday life, and certainly it's not what we rely on in a pandemic like this, which requires some sort of coordination across countries, and even within a country, it's a major logistical enterprise. So I think the mistake we make, and this is where we get back to sort of science and theology, is really the mistake we make as Christians and as scientists is to think that scientific healing isn't spiritual, that it isn't like Jesus' healing. But I think it is. And I think scientific healing is very much God's healing as well, and that we should see it that way. I think that we make a mistake when we deny this healing to the poor and the isolated, or when we make it so expensive that it profits just a few. And certainly when I lived in the US, I think you could sort of see the institutions that spring up around medicine, you know, insurance companies and legal profession, for example. And that sort of feels as though it's almost like the powers and principalities. But healing itself in Western medicine, I think, definitely is Jesus' healing. So that will be my answer, is that really we do have healing like Jesus, and it is a gift from God, and that we should be seeing it as a gift from God.
Thank you. That was great. I'm sure there are things to tease out there, so let's have 1 or 2 questions to get a discussion going. I hadn't heard of the phrase scientific healing before, but that's been helpful. It's somehow, to me, it's a grace of God that has come to us, that is part of our stewardship of creation, in a sense, that has been developed tremendously, of course. I'll let you mull.
Just to finally warn everybody out.
I think we sometimes are guilty of having a dichotomy between, you know, Jesus' approach to healing, and we want to emulate that or nothing. And somehow we've got a model in our minds that is not nuanced nearly enough. I think seeing science in that way is really helpful to me. Any other questions, folks? Oh, there's one come through, Tony. And yet evil in the form of profit-taking in the healing industry is still a miracle in terms of the possibility of healing for the poor of the world. What do you make of that?
I think I need a bit more explanation.
I think so. Do we here, Tony? We'll come to you again directly.
Well, that tells me I need to be more clear in making my statements or asking questions. I guess it harks back to a point you made a little earlier, in that this virus in itself, while we are describing in some cases this virus as a natural evil, we haven't yet seen it run its course. And it may yet prove to be the answer to another question that has yet to be asked. So for me, yes, there is a moral evil in the form of some of those pharmaceutical companies and the prices they charge for some of the medicines and so forth that they don't distribute otherwise to the poor of the world. And it would be so simple to send off, medicine A, B, C in large quantities to parts of the world. But yes, we could, and yes, we should certainly think about that, and yes, we should certainly be aiming at healing illness and disease in those other countries. But there are also unintended consequences, and we come back to this relationship with creation, and I guess that's the nature of my question. Do we take a short-term view, or do we take a long-term view? And do we do it and damn the consequences, or do we wait and assess best we can over the longer haul?
I think I'm still a bit confused. So if we were to wait, what would we be doing?
Well, that's right. I'm not sure there's an answer, right?
Okay.
And I think what I'm wrestling with is this tension between something that is evil now and might yet answer a question that we haven't or doesn't know we exist. Right?
The virus might answer a question.
Yes, exactly. It might. Our answer to the question of the virus might yet reveal an answer that we need for some of the question that we don't know exists yet.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Ebola, sort of in a sense, I don't know if this is what you mean, but I mean, in the research that was a response to Ebola, there were drugs that are being used now. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
I mean, our ability to map this virus, our ability to get to the genome comes from the evil of previous viruses and our ability to do all of that. So there is good that comes from that previous evil.
And there is this strange thing, which I mentioned before, that evolvability seems to be very dependent on viral inserts as well. And so there is this strange codependency between all life and viruses, which I think is only just beginning to be discovered and to be understood. So we can't even say about viruses that they're all bad. They seem to be an integral part of the evolution of life. Not that this one's going to be anytime soon, I think.
Okay, we'll swing on to our next question here from Gray Manicom. How does an individual's faith affect their own healing? Because that was a thing, wasn't it, back then? The link between...
Jesus' time, you mean? Well, was it? I mean, Jesus wasn't able to heal in one neighborhood, but... and
yet the man, the paralytic, lowered through the roof.
Yeah.
It appeared to be the friend's faith.
It was the friends, and sometimes it was the mother of the child or whatever. It did seem that people had to approach him. Yeah.
Yes.
And in that sense, it depended on faith, which is interesting. But perhaps faith also means being open to the transcendent in a sense, and therefore being open to healing. So yes, I think we get into very tricky territory, of course, and I think being open to healing, having faith, is part of healing, but it's obviously only a part of it, and it becomes less of a part of it in Western healing, in scientific healing, than it does in other forms of healing, I think. And yeah.
Okay.
Of course, the Christian Science people would say that it was still a very important aspect of healing. And if we might yet find that it is, in fact. I think that kind of openness is probably also very important in well-being in ordinary everyday life, but probably not in curing oneself of a pandemic. Yes.
I understand that there's a lot of studies have uncovered this link between a person's spirituality or faith and their ability to recover from disease.
Yes, I mean, some of those studies only show a very weak link, though. I mean, you mean the prayer studies? There are
yeah, but also a person's posture toward faith.
Yeah, yeah.
General posture toward faith.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
which would be any faith, I think, too. You know.
Probably. Yeah. Let's move on to Philip and Christine. From Philip, this is, frustration is very much felt between the power of medication and the power of God to heal, as stated in the Bible. Frustration is very much felt between the power of medication and the power of God to heal, as stated in the Bible. Some of this perhaps we've touched on before, but if you could just briefly, I'm just aware of time now.
I don't think there is a conflict, because I think medication does ultimately come from the natural world. It's a very in our case, it's a very technologically derived product that we use. But it's a form of using herbs, and many of our discoveries of new drugs even now come from directly from the natural world, or from little bits of soil or whatever. And so I don't think there is any kind of conflict there. I think that they're all gifts of God, and they are all, I mean, it is extraordinary and sort of worthy of awe, really, that all these substances do exist in the natural world, which are able to heal. You know, I think that's extraordinary, and it's not something we should necessarily take for granted, that they're there, and you know.
Okay, and something from says Susan here, but it might be Philip Baldwin. Yes, following on from Tony's point, does the virus lead to newer and better approaches to how we treat the environment and one another? There's a couple of other sentences here, so hold that. So some good comes from that previous evil. That's an act of faith when they approached Jesus. We forget the biggest miracle of the 20th century was the discovery of penicillin. What a gift from God.
Yes, I agree. I mean, penicillin, you know, out of the earth came this stuff, and and it did have an extraordinary effect on human life. And but so the first question, I mean, is it going to help us with the environment? That's what we all hope, isn't it? That suddenly finding that we can't drive and that we can't fly, that we have to live more ecologically, that we've all enjoyed being out on our bicycles or walking. I mean, that will change us. Whether it will or not, of course, is another matter. And we can't ignore the fact that you know, huge unemployment and economic deprivation is coming as well. So who knows about the future? We can only pray about it. But we have more of a chance here than anywhere else, of course, of having some sort of redemptive effect from all of this.
Okay, well, we've probably got time for one more. If something's on your mind and you're bursting with it, please. Okay, something from Megan again. Are there parallels between the pandemic and climate change in terms of causal factors and our response to it? Parallels between the pandemic and climate change.
Well, I think all those pictures that we saw at the beginning, you know, Wuhan in December, and Wuhan in February, Lombardy in December or January, and Lombardy in February, sort of show that both, you know, as I was sort of saying before, that there seems to be this this high incidence of the virus in places that were extremely polluted, but also that just, you know, within a few weeks of everybody being locked up, there was such a huge difference that was visible in the air and the climate, in fact. Apparently, our greenhouse gases have only gone down by 8% with all of this, and they need to go down a whole lot more each year. So that's a slightly depressing figure to come out of all of this. But yes, I think that it's made us very aware of the climate. It's made us see that we can change. It's brought us all, I think, an awareness of what's going on in the natural world and how we do need to be worried about climate. It probably should make us aware that, you know, that we didn't heed the pandemic, and we're not heeding climate change, and there are parallels there as well. You know, so we need to be doing that.
Absolutely. Okay, Megan, any further questions on parallels between the pandemic and climate change? I think that's a great question to have brought up.
No, I think it's just, I think, a challenging time for us. You know, I think the biggest response is what now? And I think that's something that we all as Christians need to think about as our response. Yeah, in that sort of context.
Absolutely, but so do governments, don't they? You know, I mean,
exactly. Well, what it inspired me was that governments work together. I mean, I write poetry, and one of the parallels I thought about was, you know, we've had conflict, we've had famine, we've had all these things, and a virus that largely affected Europe seemed to galvanize governments. There's a you know, there are some bigger political issues there, I guess. But I do think that we've shown that we have the capability of collaborating, and I would hope that that and cooperation are the ways that we work together in the future.
Hopefully, yes.
I think the scientific community has demonstrated that in spades, and maybe they can, you know, illustrate ways of cooperating in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I'm just about to ask Jenny to close off for us, but I will ask one final question that was kind of hinted at earlier on. If you know, a person asked us tomorrow, you know, where is God in the pandemic, and we just had, you know, a minute or two to give a response, could you give us, say, 3 bullet points? I know theologians usually like to write chapters rather than have bullet points, but I think that's a great practical way to finish in some ways. What 3 kind of issues or points would you suggest be offered for a question like that? That has been our topic for tonight.
Well, I suppose, I mean, you know, as Christians, our first instinct is to say that you know, God is a God of healing and is suffering with us in this pandemic, so that God is a source of healing, but is also present in this healing with us, and that all the glimpses that we get in Scripture and in our life together of as Jordan was saying, you know, an eschatological peace are what should give us hope to continue when sometimes it looks as though it's very bleak. Yeah, so I don't know whether that's 3, but that will have to do.
Yes, it's almost 9 o'clock. That's fine. I'll hand over to my colleague Jenny for a closing off. Thank you, Jenny.
So thank you so much, Nicola. It's been, I think, I'm not sure there's going to be too much sleep in the wee hours tomorrow morning, because I think you've given us lots to think about and lots to reflect on, and it's and also those who've contributed from the floor. thank you, or the gallery. It's great to have those exchanges, and I hope that we'll keep those going, and particularly lovely to have so many people represented tonight from different places within our diocese and around the country, and across also the Christians and science community. So I think it's sitting at that interface between who we are as Christians, but also what for those who can talk in that realm of science and research and dialogue. There's really important work to do there in that whole collaboration and going forward. And so Nicola will certainly be praying for you as you continue in that interface in your teaching and writing, and just those opportunities too that we do have to engage just in those coffee cup conversations, which we hope soon will be able to be had face to face. So thank you so much for giving your time this evening, and good for people to make those connections with you too, which I hope can go on in the future. They'll know that you're someone there who's a really good person to know about and to be able to talk to, or perhaps ask questions to. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and we wish you all well for your ministry in the future too.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to talk to all of you. And if you have any other questions or comments, please do send them my way. And I think we're going to enter into some sort of relationship with St. Barnabas. So it's really wonderful to have a group of Christians who do care about science and do want to have this sort of interaction. So thank you so much. It's been great.
So just a reminder that Nicola is a co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science. They've got a fabulous website. If anyone is interested in following that up, just go to their website. There's lots of resources and ways to respond. So once again, thank you very much, Nicola. And I'm going to go to my little screen here that says reactions and give you a hand. And I invite others to do that if you'd like to. And I wish everyone well. Thank you so much for coming. God bless you as you go.
Thank you very much. Sleep well, everybody.